Good evening or good morning, wherever you are in the world. I'm Regina Yao, and I'm moderating the 8th Google Hangout session of the 5th International Women's Day edition of our Read for Pixels campaign. So through Read for Pixels, the Pixel Project is collaborating with 14 award-winning best-selling women writers to raise awareness about violence against women and to raise funds for the Pixel Project to keep our efforts to end violence against women alive and kicking, as well as help us reveal the first mystery celebrity male role model portrait in our Celebrity Male Role Model Pixel Reveal campaign. So we'll be telling you more about the Read for Pixels fundraiser, which has lots and lots of exclusive author goodies a little later in this session. And you can find out more about the Pixel Project, about violence against women and what you can do about it by going to www.thepixelproject.net. Now today we have a really special guest. We're going to have a live discussion and Q&A session with the fabulous Sarah MacLean. And Sarah is the New York Times, Washington Post, and USA Today best-selling author of historical romance novels that have been translated into more than 20 languages. And Sarah is also a monthly columnist for the Washington Post. She is a leading advocate for the romance genre, and her support of romance and the women who read it earned her a place on Jezebel.com's Sheroes list of 2014 and led Entertainment Weekly to call her gracefully furious. A graduate of Smith College and Harvard University, Sarah now lives in Brooklyn with her husband and daughter. And Sarah has generously donated some really, really awesome treats to the stash of author goodies that we have up as perks for donors on our Read for Pixels fundraising page. Now, her lovely Feminist and Furious book bundle, which contains her Scandal and Scoundrel series, 8 mass paperbacks, and a special bonus of the hardcover edition of the novella anthology, How the Duke Stole Christmas. Now, that has already gone. And I'm going to put Sarah on screen because we're going to say thank you to Emily for donating so generously, donating $160 to us. Thank you, Emily. We will put the money to good use to fund all our campaigns and all our programs. And we also have one more treat left from Sarah, and that is a written critique session for the first 50 pages of your work in progress or your query letter. And if you write female-led fiction, this is a great chance to actually have Sarah look at your work and send you the critique. And Sarah knows what she's doing, so this is going to be really, really valuable. And after Sarah has emailed you her critique, she will also answer one round of follow-up questions from you via email. Just one round. So go through the critique, and if you have any questions, just list them out and send them winging to Sarah. And that's still up on our fundraising page. Now, we have raised $1,735 towards a $5,000 goal so far. And the fundraiser will end on April 15, 2019. So please give generously to help us reach our fundraising goal. As we said to Emily just now, all funds go towards the Pixel Project's work to end violence against women, including this program, Read for Pixels, where we get authors to speak out about violence against women, gender, sexism, misogyny in books and pop culture. And if you are watching this session on YouTube right now, welcome. You will be able to ask Sarah questions live today, and Sarah will answer them live. Just make sure you're logged into your YouTube account so that you can type your questions into the chat box to the right of the screen. And Denisha, who is today's producer and chat box moderator, will relay them to me to read out to Sarah to answer. So we'll be here for about another hour, 50 minutes. And just get your questions in as early as possible so we can fit them in around the discussion. So now I'm going to put Sarah on screen.
Hi everyone.
Sarah. Welcome to Read for Pixels.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's such an important organization, and it's violence against women is a cause I care deeply about. So I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah. So you're going to read something for us today, yeah?
Yeah, I am. So you asked me to read. When you asked me to read, I thought about a number of pieces from a number of books I've written. Women who are victims of domestic violence in other books, but I actually think that the book that probably is most appropriate for tonight is my book, The Day of the Duchess, which I rewrote. It was due in December of 2016, and in early November 2016, a major thing happened in the United States. And on November 9th, I woke up the morning after the election, and I threw out 275 pages of this book and rewrote it. Because I realized that the story that I had been telling about this couple was no longer a story that I could tell, no longer a story that I wanted to tell. And I basically wanted the story at that point to end with the hero dying a terrible death and then the heroine just living single and amazing for the rest of her life. Which doesn't work so well when you're writing romance novels. So I rewrote The Day of the Duchess, which is it's a marriage in trouble story, essentially. It's the book I call my divorce book because the hero and heroine have been married for years at the start of this book, and they have been separated 3 years. 3 years earlier, I write historical romances. So 3 years earlier, the heroine took off. She left him and she left London, and she went to America to find herself and establish herself as a human being separate from marriage and from men. And she returns. She's started a tavern in America. She has a singing career now. She's a legendary singer. And she has a problem, which is that she wants to own her own businesses outright. And she wants to be a person outright and not chattel. And in the 1830s in England, if you were married, you and everything you owned and everything you were belonged to your husband. And she hates her husband at the start of this book. And so she returns to England, and she has a problem, which is she wants a divorce. But the only way that you can get a divorce in England in 1830 is by act of parliament. So the book begins with in Malcolm, the hero's point of view, and it is the last day of Parliament in 1833. And I'll just read to you this is chapter 1 of The Day of the Duchess, and it is it's the final. Haven, the hero, is in Parliament, and what we know at this point is that something has gone wrong, and something's gone wrong, and he's made a terrible mistake, and he spends and it's about to be summer. So okay. It was August and hot as hell on the floor of Parliament, the air rank with sweat and perfume. The windows were open to allow a breeze into the room, a barely there stirring that only exacerbated the stench, adding the reek of the Thames to the already horrendous smell within. At home, the river ran cool and crisp, unsullied by the filth of London. At home, the air was clean, promising summer idyll and hinting at more, at the future. At least it had done, until the pieces of home had peeled away and he'd been left alone without it. Now it felt like nothing but land. Home required more than a river and rolling hills. Home required her, and so he would do this summer what he had done every moment he'd been away from London for the past 2 years and 7 months exactly. He would search for her. She hadn't been in France or in Spain, where he'd spent the summer prior, chasing down English women in search of excitement. She hadn't been in She hadn't been any of the false widows he'd found in Scotland, nor the governess at the imposing manor in Wales, nor the woman he'd tracked in Constantinople the month after he'd left, who'd been a charlatan playing at being an aristocrat. And then there'd been the woman in Boston, the one he'd been so sure of, the one they called the Dove. Not Sarah, never Sarah. She had disappeared as though she'd never existed. There one moment and gone the next, laden with enough funds to vanish, and just as he'd realized how much he wanted her. But her money would run out eventually, and she would have no choice but to stop running. He, on the other hand, was a man with power and privilege and exorbitant wealth, enough to find her the moment she stopped. And he would find her. He slid into one of the long benches surrounding the speaker's floor, where the Lord Chancellor had already begun. "My lords, if there is no more formal business," the Chancellor intoned, "we will close this year's parliamentary session." A chorus of approval, fists pounding on seatbacks around the hall, echoed through the chamber. Haven exhaled and resisted the urge to scratch at his wig, knowing that if he gave in to the desire, he would become consumed with its rough discomfort. "My lords," the Lord Chancellor called, "is there indeed no additional formal business for the current session?" A rousing chorus of "Nay" boomed through the room, and one would think the House of Lords was filled with schoolboys desperate for an afternoon in the local swimming hole, instead of nearly 200 pompous aristocrats eager to get to their mistresses. The Lord Chancellor grinned, his ruddy face gleaming with sweat beneath his wig, as he spread his wide hands over his ample girth. "Well then, it is His Majesty's royal will and pleasure." The enormous doors to the chamber burst open, the sound echoing through the quiet hall, competing with the Chancellor's voice. Heads turned, but not Haven's. He was too eager to leave London and his wig behind to worry about whatever was going on beyond. The Lord Chancellor collected himself, cleared his throat, and said, "That this Parliament be prorogued to Thursday, the 7th day of October next." A collection of disapproving harumphs began as the door shut with a powerful bang. Haven looked then, following the gazes of the men assembled to the now closed door to the chambers. He couldn't see anything amiss. "Ahem," the Lord Chancellor said, to the sound full of disapproval, before he redoubled his commitment to closing the session. Thank God for that. "Thursday, the 7th day of October next." "Before you finish, my Lord Chancellor." Haven stiffened. The words were strong and somehow soft and lilting and beautifully feminine, and so out of place in the House of Lords, off limits to women. Surely that was why his breath caught. Surely that was why his heart began to pound, why he was suddenly on his feet amid a chorus of masculine outrage. It was not because of the voice itself. "What is the meaning of this?" the Chancellor thundered. He could see it then, the cause of the commotion. A woman, taller than any woman he'd ever known, in the most beautiful lavender dress he'd ever seen, perfectly turned out, as though she'd marched into parliamentary session on a regular basis. As though she were the Prime Minister himself, as though she were more than that, as though she were royalty, the only woman he'd ever loved, the only woman he'd ever hated, the same and somehow entirely different, and Haven frozen to the spot. "I confess," she said, moving to the floor of the chamber with ease as though she were at a ladies' tea, "I feared I would miss the session altogether, but I'm very happy that I might sneak in before you all escape to wherever it is that you gentlemen venture for pleasure." She grinned at an ancient earl who blushed under the heat of her gaze and turned away. "However, I'm told that what I seek requires an act of Parliament, and you are, as you know, Parliament." Her gaze found his, her eyes precisely as he remembered, blue as the summer sea, but now somehow different. Where they were once open and honest, they were now shuttered and private. Christ, she was here. Nearly 3 years searching for her, and here she was, as though she'd been gone mere hours. Shock warred with anger he could not have imagined, but those two emotions were nothing compared to the third, the immense, unbearable pleasure. She was here, finally, again. It was all he could do not to move, to gather her up and carry her away and hold her close and win her back and start fresh. Except she did not seem to be here for that. She watched him for a long moment, her gaze unblinking, before she declared, I am Seraphina Bevingstoke, Duchess of Haven, and I require a divorce.
Yeah.
So that's the first chapter of what is this? The Day of the Duchess.
Yeah, that was when I read it, that was what struck me is that historically, I think women in England, at least in England, I'm not sure about Scotland, they couldn't even apply for their own credit cards or loans until I think was it in 1970s or the early 1970s.
That's true of the United States too. In the United States, if you were married, you couldn't carry your own credit card or have your own checking account until 1972.
Yeah, and I've been a feminist since I was 12. So because I'm ethnic Chinese, it's a very 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 patriarchal culture as well. And what struck me is that things have come so far, but obviously not far enough. That's why we're sitting here having this chat. But things have come so far that even as a kid, I had my own bank account. So the idea that you cannot have your own bank account unless your dad or your husband signed off on it or your grandfather, that was until the 1970s. That was shocking. Really shocking.
What's really interesting is that so in this book, Sarah asks for a divorce and she petitions Parliament for a divorce, but the number of women, so it's been a long time since I've talked a lot about this book, so I'm probably going to get some of these numbers wrong, so don't quote me, but I can give them to you separately. There were maybe, say, 470 or just shy of 500 divorces actually granted by Parliament ever. And of all of them, I think there were only 3 that were petitioned by women. And they were really tremendously heinous crimes that had been, where the women absolutely deserved to be granted a divorce.
Yeah, and were they granted a divorce? They were, right?
There were only 3. What ended up what was kind of commonplace in the 19th century to get a divorce was the husbands and wives would work together to do it. So, but it was much more. Wives couldn't speak on Parliament floor. They couldn't testify on their own behalf. So you needed your husband to agree separately, privately, that you would be able to be divorced. And then you would present the argument as female adultery, because that was basically the only thing that a Parliament would grant a divorce for, especially to a peer, to a member of the aristocracy. So what would happen is they would stage an adulterous relationship, an adulterous event between the wife and, say, a servant or just sort of a random person, a random man. And then they would have a servant come in and sort of accidentally witness this adulterous event. And then that servant could then testify on behalf of the husband at a divorce proceeding. But it required an immense amount of trust from wives, because Parliament would say, yes, this is true, this is abhorrent, women are, terrible, and this is clearly a situation where the wife has been unfaithful, and you would be given nothing. You'd be granted nothing as a woman by Parliament. So you would have to walk away with no money, no funds, nothing, no access to your children. So in cases where it is documented that it was agreed upon, it required wives trusting their husbands that they would bestow money, time with children, access to children, at homes, etc., on them before they actually went that route. I mean, it's abhorrent.
It's appalling, because if there's domestic violence, I mean, you're essentially being asked to trust your abuser. And even today, the courts still have, vestiges of that. It is up to your husband, but, forcing joint custody when really joint custody is not in the interest of the kids, because guess what? If he beats you, he beats your kids too. And your pets. and everything else, and he isolates you. So that is just appalling. So basically, right up until recently, I think in most cultures, everyone is, if it's patriarchal, everyone's kind of stuck.
Yeah.
Well, women are stuck, and yet
women especially are stuck. Yeah.
It's untenable. And we hear women going, I can't leave because he won't let me take the kids. I can't leave because he threatened the cat.
Right.
Yeah, no, that's,
yeah.
And it's still going on. It's still going on. Courts are still, no matter what some people say, courts are still very much in favor of the dad. I think recently, you say recently, I think, is it New Jersey or can't remember which state off my top of my head, but only recently did they say that rapists would not have access to the kids that they fathered when they raped the woman.
Yeah.
And then you look, and then you read the news, like, then go, what?
Yeah.
What?
It's patriarchy is a hell of a drug.
Oh, yeah. So let's get started on your talking about your books and characters, because the questions from everyone in the chat box are rolling in. Guys, if you have any questions, keep them coming. We will fit them around the discussion clusters. So all of your stories feature complex female protagonists such as Lady Isabel Townsend in 10 Ways to Be Adored When Landing a Lord, Felicity Fairclough in Wicked and the Wallflower, and Serafina, whom you just whose book you just read. And they are tough, they are resilient, and they are determined, and they do what struck me and struck a lot of the Pixel Project team, because we all read your books, as I mentioned to you.
Very kind.
Mentioned to you earlier, is that they, like women today, they do their best with the cards they are dealt with in life. Because when you're born female, you are dealt a certain hand of cards. Whether you're born wealthy or you're born middle class or you're born poor, it cuts across class, it cuts across ethnicity, race, and religion. If you're born female, you are born with a certain hand of cards, and that it's normally not a great hand of cards that you're dealt. No. So who or what are the inspiration behind your wonderful female characters?
Oh, I feel like every one of my female characters is inspired by every one of the women I sort of meet and interact with regularly. They're inspired by the women that I work, other writers. They're inspired by friends, by family, by women in history. One of the benefits of writing historical romance is that I can write these characters and really show women in battle. In battle with society and with men and with rigid sort of constraints of society, in a way that really, I think, throws into relief the issues that face women, like you said, now, here, today, in 2019. And I think it's very, I mean, I wrote it, it's such a vast sort of, it's a disparate world of people. I mean, Serafina's series is the Scandal and Scoundrel series. That was all based on celebrity gossip and the way that the world treats women. That series has what I refer to as my sex tape book that I was writing when there was a hack on celebrity cell phone pictures, and a bunch of nudes were stolen from famous women and posted online because for some reason we think we have access to, we just should have ownership of women's bodies. And so that book was very much about slut shaming and how we talk about sex and women. But things like you mentioned, Isabel from 10 Ways to Be Adored. And I went to Smith College, which is an all women's college. Isabel's house in the country is based, on Smith. It's based on, a community of women. I find it very difficult to write a book that doesn't have a community of women in it. And even when I try, Wicked and the Wallflower is a good example. Felicity is really alone. Like, she's very, she doesn't have a good solid community of sisterhood to turn to. But over the arc of the series, it becomes, the third, I'm right now working on the third book in the series, and it's of course about a community of women, because I keep coming back to them because I find that we inspire each other all the time.
Yeah, and when you think about it, this community of women, it's been happening all over the world in so many different cultures, because who else is going to support us when we're living in a patriarchy? Who else is going to, if your husband leaves you and the kids, who is your support network? Your support network is going to be your female friends, your mom, if she's around and you have a working relationship with her, the women in your family, your aunties are often sidelined, even though they're champs at, taking in your nieces and nephews when they need to. We all, and the way women lead, if you look at a female led startup versus a male led startup, the way the company is organized, or if you look at any organization, any project, if it's female led, the organization structure is really different. It's more like what you said, it's a community, it's more lateral.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I also think something's really interesting about domesticity and women. So women traditionally, in many cultures around the world, are responsible for the domestic, for the private home, the things that happen inside the four walls of a house, outside of public view. And they're responsible for children and for housework and for the sort of domestic experience. And what's interesting is that experience is so private, and it is so unseen, and so little media actually tackles that world, that sort of that world of women, except romance does, right? Romance centers that world, and centers women in that world. And so I think it's also, I feel very blessed to be writing in a genre that allows me to explore all of these, really unique relationships between women in private. And then in sort of a meta sense, the books explore these private relationships. And then it's almost like the conversation between me as author and reader of romance novels, which are considered women's media, is a private conversation that happens kind of outside of the awareness of patriarchy. And I always find that to be sort of a really subversive, interesting conversation that I get to have with readers in a really personal way.
Yeah, and we'll talk about genre. We'll go more into genre a little later. But just to round up this talking about your female characters, when you create and write women like Pippa and Chase, and and they are all really unconventional women for their time, or maybe they aren't. Maybe because women's history has been always hidden, because who writes the winners write history, right?
Right.
So instead of getting her story, we're getting history. So when you write, do you decide? I mean, obviously you focus on non-traditional heroines, but do you ever feel pressured by gender and genre stereotypes to make your heroines likable or relatable? Especially romance, where happily ever afters are expected. And do you ever get any flack for making a female character not likable enough?
Absolutely. I feel like any writer who's writing writing a different heroine in every book, which is what I do try to do, eventually writes the unlikable heroine. And I've probably written more. I've received a lot of mail about heroines. Some of them are much more likable than others, I think. And I use I should say, like, likable and kind of unlikable heroines, I don't think they exist, right? I mean, when somebody says, "Oh, I found that heroine very unlikable," it's often, to me, a message that the heroine had a nuance. really, it had like a complex relationship with the world around her and her past and her future. And who among us doesn't have that, right? I mean, we're all unlikable in some way. I've written, so I think there's that. I do think that there is a general sense of like everyone in the, again, specific to the genre that I write, everyone in historical time, in olden time, being every woman being meek and biddable. And it's just not true. I mean, Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, which is basically, arguably a conversation about, childbirth, birth it, like the monster is the whole thing is about childbirth, right? And you think about, Wollstonecraft wrote on the vindication of the rights of women in the 1700s. Lizzie Bennet is, arguably the great grandmother of all romance heroines ever. And Lizzie turns Darcy down. There's nothing meek or biddable about her. There was nothing meek or biddable about Jane Austen. Ada Lovelace, who was Byron's daughter, she was a computer programmer in the 1820s. And you're right, history's written by men mostly. I think what we're learning now, what we're starting to see is we're starting to unpack a lot of women in history and see that they were doing amazing, remarkable things alongside men. And I should also say they were doing amazing, remarkable things with men supporting them. I mean, Byron's daughter was completely distant from her father, but she worked with a man named Charles Babbage, who basically invented the first computer or a computing machine. And Babbage adored her and thought that she was a genius and helped to bring her creation to the world. So it's not always against men, in spite of men, but it is often in spite of men.
Yeah, and your historical romances are inherently feminist. I mean, they are one part swoony romance, we all love that, and one part feminist history lesson, which we've been talking about, which you highlight sexism, misogyny, violence against women, and the limited options that women have for steering their own lives, especially when things go wrong. So from a writer's point of view, I mean, how do you write about these issues with the necessary sensitivity without making them seem like a gratuitous plot point?
Sure. I think that the answer to that is these are issues that women face. I mean, it's easy to write about these issues honestly when you see them clearly in the world around you. I have never written a heroine who is a survivor of, well, actually that's not true. I wrote Mara, who is the heroine of No Good Duke Goes Unpunished, has an abusive father. But I've never written a spousal abuse relationship. I've written them around the edges of books. Several sort of secondary characters have had them. The trick, I think, is going into it, trying, first to no harm, trying to make sure that you're not going to upset readers or trigger readers or make readers, what you want to do is present an honest, nuanced and sensitive view of a complicated issue. This book, The Day of the Duchess, involves a stillbirth, which is we don't talk about these issues in the world, but women talk about them among each other. I mean, I think many, many women probably know somebody who's lost a child late in the pregnancy, but nobody talks about that publicly. It's too private. And it is the realm of women. So I often think that it's my responsibility as a writer who is a woman, who is writing a genre that centers women and that is about women, and that centers the female gaze. It's my work to represent that gaze as thoughtfully and as in a complicated, complex, nuanced way that will feel authentic.
Yeah, and you do this, but do you think writers who write historical fiction of any kind have a responsibility to address these issues in their stories because they choose to set their stories in a particular historical period?
I think good writers do. I think good writers have to. I think that when we talk, when we talk about writing historical fiction, it is impossible for us to write historical fiction without modernity being a part of it. We live in a modern age with modern ideas, and it's our work to represent those ideas it's our work to iterate on the world around us as much as it is to tell the story of the past, right? But like I said, like you said, these heroines aren't antithetical to history, and to their historical counterparts. And there have been feminists for millennia, and Queen Elizabeth I was a feminist, and she rode into battle, and those kinds of things are. Anytime somebody says to me, well, that's a modern idea and it didn't exist then, I can usually point them in the direction of a person or a text that proves that otherwise.
But the term feminist just gets such a people use it, people treat it in a derogatory way, and I just like to point out, I mean, even women who don't call themselves feminists the term did not exist during Elizabeth I's time. It did not exist during Cleopatra's time.
No.
And just to give an example, like the women in my family, except for me, would never call themselves feminists. But yesterday, I just realized that, in 4 generations, we went from bound feet and arranged marriages and not going to school to a whole bunch of us in my generation. I mean, my grandmothers both my grandmothers on both sides of the family, their granddaughters, there's me. I went to Oxford. There's my female cousins. They are doctors. They are lawyers. They are 4 generations.
Mm-hmm.
It can come. It's just that they don't call themselves feminists.
Sure. And that's fine. They don't have to call themselves feminists. The movement works for them anyway.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
It's, even if, who was it who said that, it is, even if you hate the word feminist, it is still my job to make sure you still have your rights as a woman.
Right.
Society. So that's what we do. So let's talk genre. So romance genre is the biggest selling genre today. And it has been criticized for being anti-feminist. I'm just shaking my head, guys. You can't see me, but I'm shaking my head. Of providing unrealistic portrayals of sexual and romantic relationships and of glorifying toxic relationships. And you are one of the most vocal and outstanding champions of the romance genre.
Yeah.
So in your books and stories, you've always made it clear that consent is vital in relationships and that it isn't a death knell to romance. However, the line between consent and coercion hasn't always been made clear in romance books, especially the older ones. So do you think that this is an issue that romance writers have started tackling successfully in recent years?
I think there's absolutely no question that consent is a piece of is a big piece of the discussion about romance now in the last few years. And there's anytime anybody's talking about consent, that's a good thing, right? So setting that aside, I think that often, and this is partially just the fact that romance has, by virtue of being a genre about and for and by women, it's always sort of been set in the corner as being less valuable for research or less valuable for study or for critique. And I think that invariably we think back on those early books and we say, oh, well, they they glorified rape, or the hero rapes the heroine in the beginning of a lot of those books, which is true. And I think that what's really interesting is that in most of those books, not all of them, but in many, many of those books, and certainly in the books that we sort of point to as seminal texts of the genre, the rape on the page is called that, is not accepted. It's it's overtly condemned in them, and consent is there on the page by virtue of the story being about the heroine's rape, right? So I think about the book The Flame and the Flower, which is the 1972 book that the book in 1972 that sort of historians and scholars of the genre point to as the first. And in that book, the hero rapes the heroine 4 times in the first 100 pages. And he is the hero. By the end of the book, they are in love. They live happily ever after. And what's interesting about that is the heroine won't have it. At every moment, she refers to it as such. She refers to him as a rapist. She talks about consent. It's there on the page. And what I think about a lot is 2 things. One, there is a sort of larger question, a larger sort of suggestion that perhaps this is a metaphor, right? That the hero represents patriarchy, right? As is metaphorically patriarchy. And so what we're seeing is this sort of arc of the women's struggle, right? To find equality, to be considered partner, to have sort of a realistic partnership and relationship in love, in equality. That said, it's also a question of, in 1972, like we were talking about, women could be raped by their husbands, right? They couldn't have their own credit cards. They didn't have the kind of, it feels like 1972 is no amount of time from where we are, but it's just leagues away from us when we talk about women's rights. And I think that what's happening is that conversation is being had on the page in romance novels in a really subversive way then. And so I would never dream of saying those books didn't have this conversation, because consent has been on the page of romance novels from that first book, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. Now it's more fun, right? Now when we talk about consent, we talk about things like dirty talk, right? When the hero and heroine are like having sex on the page and enjoying it and talking dirty to each other. That's ongoing consent. That's how we should all be existing as sexual beings in sexual partnership. It's better now, but it was there then. And I think it had a real, I think the conversation about consent was really incredibly powerful then too, by virtue of the storylines.
Yeah, and in the US, I think in quite a few states, marital rape wasn't a crime until I think the 1990s.
90s, yeah. Which is, it's hard to imagine, right? And certainly, and it wasn't a crime, and until it wasn't grounds for divorce until just slightly earlier than that.
Yeah, and every time when I work in this field, right, violence against women, and every time I think, or my team thinks, or any of our colleagues across the movement think, we've seen it all. Someone just goes, holds my beer.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and following what you said earlier, which ties into what you just said. You said you rewrote The Day of the Duchess after the 2016 elections. Mm-hmm. And that got me in mind of this. There was an article that came out, I'm not sure if it was the Washington Post or New York Times or Los Angeles Times. There are quite a few romance authors who were talking about how after the election, they, in the last 2 years, 2-3 years, they all rewrote a significant amount of their whatever manuscripts they were works they had. And then thinking, if you think about it, fiction in whatever genre reflects what is happening around the author, but this is incredibly an incredibly conscious decision of the genre,
Sure.
authors and genre responding to it. It's incredible, absolutely.
Yeah. It's really about the fact that, so romance is really interesting. It's different than every other genre for lots of reasons. I mean, I've talked about the fact that it's the only genre that is specifically overtly for women, and overtly centering women, the female gaze, right? Female identity at the center of it. And I mean, obviously, when I say this, I'm painting with a broad brush, but 85% of romance novels do this. I mean, there's lots of wonderful queer and male and non-binary romance. And I'm setting those aside for this conversation. But when we talk about the genre and we talk about it in that way, I think what we're also talking about is a constant iteration on women's issues, as you said. But what also is different about romance is that we write very fast. Mm-hmm. I don't write very fast, but a lot of other people in the genre write very fast. Readers are reading 10 to 12, like voracious romance readers are reading 10 to 12 books a month, sometimes more. And the reader and writers are writing much, much faster. And so what romance is doing, and we've always written fast, like a book a year has always been a standard in romance. And now we're seeing like a book every 6 months, a book every 4 months as being very not uncommon. So when we are writing, we are constantly iterating on right now. This is happening in the news. I'm writing a book. I'm going to put it in my book. So when the election happened, I think there's another piece here, which is many of us are keenly aware of our responsibility as a voice, as a conversationalist with our readers, because of all of the things that I've said before about secrecy and domesticity and privacy and that sort of subversive text conversation. So I think many of us made the choice after the election to rewrite the books we were working on, or are thinking much more consciously about what we're putting into our books, because we want to make sure that our readers understand that we understand, that we're friends. You're safe with me.
And what is interesting is I brought this up with Victoria Dow.
Who is amazing.
Yeah, we had Victoria about at the beginning of the month. And what I noticed is, okay, full confession here, everybody. I have been reading romance novels since I was a teenager. And
Same.
And I come from a conservative culture, but funnily enough, my dad just thought, read whatever, and as long as it's not, horrible, putting horrible ideas in your head. And my mom was like, yeah, here you go for your birthday, lots of romance novels.
Sure.
What I noticed is that it's romance novelists, their work, it evolves. The way they tell stories and the way they treat heroes and heroines in relationships, it evolves along their writing career. So maybe in the early books they might have, and Victoria said the same. She has written stuff in her early books where she looks back at it now and cringes, but it evolves, and we don't see such steady change over the years in, I'm going to say the same thing as you did, the broad paintbrush thing, but with male authors, you don't see that much of an evolution over if they've written books, say, over a 10 to 20 year period. But romance authors do. The way they present relationships and women's roles and all, it just evolves. Say if they started writing in the 80s, their book in the 80s is the way the relationship is depicted completely different from their most recent book in 2018.
Yes. And that's partially because I think women write a different kind of book, right? I mean, and again, this is, just bear with me, but I think, romance novels are very much about emotion. They're very much about they are about relationships. They're about They're about sort of the intensity of human relationships. They're very internal in the way they tell stories. Men typically don't write books like this. Like the male genres are, thrillers and mysteries and sci-fi, and those books, those genres, particularly thrillers and mysteries, are very much about external conflicts, kind of a lone wolf and like a big bad, right? Whereas that's not doable in a romance novel. In order to solve conflict in a romance novel, communication has to happen, and there has to be evolution of character and of internal character. The characters have to change over the course of a romance novel in order to make happily ever after work and believable. The most important piece is that readers have to believe that these two people who at the beginning were completely separate are now going to make it work. And that's hard to do. But I do think that that's what I think that's why we tend to we tend to change so much, because it's a different world for women in a marriage now than it was in 1972. Maybe not for everybody. But in a broad stroke, it is.
Yeah. So let's talk about men in your books. And before we go into that, guys, we have about 20 minutes or so left. We have a question from the audience, but if you all have questions, please do put them in now. We're going to get to audience questions pretty soon after we talk about men in romance.
My favorite topic.
Yeah. Do you think there is room in romance for reframing how stories describe men, away from the hostile and toxic stereotypes and towards complexity and even vulnerability? And can this be one of the ways that romance writers can break away from, toxic tropes that promote toxic masculinity and the dehumanization of women?
Sure. I think that romance is, I think for romance to work, the hero can't be toxic we can't identify him as toxically masculine. At least we can't identify him as that for very long in the book, right? Heroes almost have to be the most nuanced character in a romance novel, because we have to be able to unpack him and believe that he is sensitive and interested in you, and a conversational, that he's willing to share with you, that he's willing to reveal his weaknesses to you. I mean, all of these things have to be are coded into a great romance hero, right? Like, what we want is a sort of crusty alpha exterior with just like a gooey, nuggety, like beta interior. And I think the best romances do that really, really well. And that speaks also to the sort of evolution of the genre, because many, many people who've never tried a romance novel, or have tried one romance novel and never again tried them in the 1980s or 90s, where we were looking at a very different kind of hero, where the actual craft of the writing was very much about like impenetrable hero and like a heroine who was who would sort of project her own idea onto what he was thinking. Now that's not how books are written at all. Now we're just as deep in the point of view of a hero as we are of a heroine. Most of the time. And so what we're starting to see is these sort of softer, more loving, lovable heroes. But all that is to say, just because a hero is, a tough guy doesn't mean he's toxic. And I think that's one of the things that we struggle with. So we are currently struggling with in 2019 is this idea of like, well, can you both be a strong, powerful, rich, privileged male hero and also be not a vehicle of the patriarchy? And I think the answer is yes. In fact, I like to think that that's what I write. Like, I write the sort of strong, powerful males who like are kings of their worlds, but ultimately are brought low by love. Mm-hmm. Which is the most human of emotions.
Yeah, and sometimes we look I personally look at the way some guys behave. I mean, like online dating, sending people I'm not going to say the word, sending people pictures of your Yeah.
Privates.
Yeah.
Private photos. Private pictures.
Sometimes I feel like those guys
No.
who read romance books read it
Yeah.
to see what women actually like instead of your privates and then just sending it to someone. No.
I mean, if I were president of the universe, I would decree that all men everywhere had to read like 5 to 10 romance novels before they started dating. Like for lots of reasons, like about sexual pleasure and relationships and everything. I feel like that it would also it's a sort of remarkable experience for men, at least the men in my life who have read my books, to sort of have this, they have a whole different view of what women think men are doing at every, like, I think romance novels could really help a lot of relationships, frankly. But also, for the record, no good romance hero would ever send an unsolicited photograph of his private area to anyone. So.
Yeah, it is. Victoria Dow actually wrote a book where the hero had to read, had to read the romance books so that he can sort of figure out. And I looked at that and I'm like, you know what? Like you said, yes, required reading.
Yes. I mean, they really should be required reading for everybody, because I think they teach a lot of wonderful lessons about like relationships and communication and equality and partnership and sex. I mean, things, you said earlier, romances are often disdained for setting up unrealistic expectations for readers. It shouldn't be an unrealistic expectation for a woman to have a partner who cares about her and thinks about her and is sensitive to her needs, and also is happy to give her an orgasm when she wants one.
Mm-hmm. So let's go to that question from the audience. It's from NGR. NG says, so excited for Wit and Hattie's story. Can you talk about your decision to have Sarah and Haven have another baby at the end of Day of the Duchess? Was there ever a time where you were going to make the opposite choice?
Yes. Here is the truth. First of all, thank you. Thank you. I hope Wit and Hattie work for you. Here is the truth about that book. I struggled right up until the book went to production with the epilogue of Day of the Duchess. And I struggled with it because I didn't want Mal and Sarah's happiness to be predicated on the requirement of children. I didn't want a magic baby to fix it all. So there are actually 2 versions of the epilogue. One version is a version where they are childless and very, very happy. And the other version is the version that exists where they have 5 children, but 4 living children. And I struggled a lot, and lots of people read both versions of the epilogue. And at the very end, I pulled the trigger on the one with children, because for me, it felt like it was the most authentic of the 2. But I will tell you that they are blissfully happy in the other one, and it could have easily gone that way.
Yeah. So guys, we have about 15 minutes left. You have just enough time to get your questions under the wire if you have any for Sarah. But let's talk about stories being one of the most powerful ways of bringing about change, because all culture is transmitted through stories. Our beliefs, our socialization is all stories. I mean, it's everything from news stories to fiction. And in your opinion, what would you say to readers and reviewers who complain that your books are too preachy about feminist issues to be completely, properly romantic?
I would say there are lots and lots of other romance writers. So my books are not for you if you think that they're too preachy. they are for someone else. And I say that with love and with hope that you will go and find happily ever after books that have happily ever after that speak to you. But for me, in 2019, in the world that we live in, it is impossible for me not to write the books that I'm writing, and not to think about the books that I'm writing as being things that I have a daughter. At some point, presumably she'll look back, she'll read my books. And I never, ever want her to think that I didn't set my views on the page, and that I didn't stand behind them. Because if you have the opportunity to speak now, you should be able to speak. And I'm in a very privileged position and able to do that.
Yeah. And what would your advice be to romance authors who want to write about difficult issues like violence against women, but are trying to balance telling an engaging story without being pedantic? What would your advice be?
It's really hard. And I would say that, I mean, I hope that my books don't feel like I'm too preachy, but I would say that the way that you do that is by building an authentic character, and establishing. You can't sort of say, well, I'm going to write a book about violence against women. That's not the role of romance. The role of romance is to write a book about two people falling in love against insurmountable odds, right? So you have to hold that in your head and know that happily ever after is the goal. And violence against women as a character arc is if you put violence in a heroine's past or in a heroine's present, you have to do it again with sort of sensitivity. I think about the writers who have done this really beautifully. I think about Kennedy Ryan, who wrote a book called Long Shot, where the heroine is in an abusive relationship for a significant portion of the book, and the hero rescues her, or he doesn't rescue her, she rescues herself, and he's there to support her. And Kennedy spent a long, long time talking to women who had been in abusive relationships to do it right. And I think when you take on a character trauma like this, your job as a writer is to just do as much listening as you can to women who have experienced these things. And that's hard, right? Particularly hard when you're writing on a hamster wheel and we're all trying to write fast and get information out. But if there's ever a reason to slow down, it's when you're writing the story of marginalized people or people in trauma.
Yeah, and also to suggest, if anyone's interested in books that in romances that look into this, Beverly Jenkins writes extremely good romances that look into all these topics.
Yes, yeah. That's true. Yeah. Also, I would recommend. So I recommended Kennedy Ryan's Long Shot. Lisa Kleypas has a contemporary called Blue-Eyed Devil, where the heroine escapes a traumatic marriage, and it's really remarkably done, and very emotional. And I know she gets a lot of letters from readers.
Yeah, I read that, and as someone reading from the point of view of anti-violence against women activists, I'm like, she nailed it. She absolutely nailed it.
She's always very careful, I know. So.
Yeah. And I think she also supports her local domestic violence organization. I think it's on her website. So when I read the book, I went to the website to see, and ta-da, she does. Good. So you mentioned that you have a daughter. So let's talk parenting. So parents are usually the most influential role models in a person's life because you're there at the beginning. And as a mom,
that terrifies me, but yes.
Well, I mean,
no, it's true. It's true. I just am consumed with anxiety that I'm not doing it right, but go on.
So as a mom, what do you think parents can do to help prevent violence against women and girls in future generations and to get boys involved in helping to do so?
God, if I had that answer, I mean, that would be the answer, right? I have a 5-year-old, and I have a very good friend named Sierra Simone, who also writes romance novels. And Sierra, I'm very lucky that Sierra has a daughter who is older than my daughter. And when my daughter was born, Sierra said to me, we made a decision that the one rule in our house was no easy answers, meaning if she asks a question, you answer it and you tell her the truth. And obviously, you can't tell her, there are a lot of things that are pretty awful, and you can't tell her all the little minutia of truth. But my husband and I try really hard to tell our daughter the truth. But then sometimes she asks you questions and you just don't have a good answer. Like today, we were watching videos of, she takes capoeira, which is a Afro-Brazilian dance, martial arts dance. You know, it's this very cool art form. And she takes it at school, and we were watching videos of it. And there were 2 men doing capoeira, and they both had their shirts off. And she said, why can't women take their shirts off? And in my head, I was like, well, patriarchy. But I don't know how to answer that question. And she was like, that doesn't seem like a fair rule. Mm. And she's not wrong. She's 5 and she's not wrong. And I was sort of like, well, you know what? You can do whatever you want at home, but this is the rule outside. And you're right. It's not fair. And I think that that's what we have to do. I think we have to acknowledge that sometimes things aren't fair. And we have to say, and then, I mean, consent-wise, that is not a gray area at all in our house. If she says stop, no matter what we're doing, I stop. And you know, if we're playing or roughhousing, the second she says stop, because her body is her body. And I think, I mean, that's all you can do. And I don't know, maybe it's all wrong. Maybe I shouldn't tell her that things aren't fair, but that's where we are. When she acknowledges that things are not fair, we talk about it. And sometimes the answer is there is no good answer.
I mean,
but I don't know. She's 5, so I'm an amateur.
You probably grow up to be a feminist too, because like I mentioned before, I was a feminist at age 12. And you know what triggered that? It's not fair.
It's not fair.
Open and close inverted commas, air quote. Yep. It's not fair when you watch your brothers being given stuff just because their private parts are different from yours.
Yeah, it's not fair.
It's not fair. It's not fair that you're saddled with unpaid childcare at age 12, you know, asked to help with the little ones, but you look at your older male cousins and they're not being asked to do that at all. It's not fair that men can walk outside with their shirts off, and we can on a hot day. So yeah, she's gonna be a feminist.
I mean, what would I do with her if she wasn't? Then I really would have failed.
What is interesting is that we've had this discussion on air with on Read for Pixels with other authors who are also moms and dads. Yeah. And one thing that they keep bringing up over and over again is the same thing that you talked about, which is even from when they're really little, we teach them about consent by making everyone, them and if they have siblings, you know, everyone and the cousins, make sure that they understand that if someone wants you to stop tickling them or touching them or taking their things or whatever, you stop.
I also think a good trick for that, for parents who don't really know how to do this, is I sometimes do it with her in the reverse, meaning you're on me. I don't feel like being touched right now. So like my body is my body. I mean, which is hard for moms to do, right? Because it feels like when you have a child, suddenly like your body is just theirs. Like your body is no longer yours. But ultimately, I think that's a big piece of it too. Like being able to say like, well, I don't really feel like having my hair brushed, like my hair played with right now. So we're not going to do that because it's my body. So being able to sort of model the stop moment is a good one.
Yeah. So we have come to the last question in our discussion. I guess everyone's just watching. There are no questions from the audience. So we have the last question now. Now, guys, I am going to ask the last question, and you still have maybe 3 minutes to get your question in under the wire. So this is gonna be a Captain Obvious question, but we ask this of all our Read for Pixels authors. You have been so very incredibly supportive of our work in stopping violence against women and our Read for Pixels campaign. One, this is a two-parter. One, why do you support the cause to end violence against women? And two, what do you think authors can do to help with the cultural change needed to eradicate violence against women and girls?
I mean, I think that there's sort of the easy answer and the hard answer to that first part. I mean, why do I support the cause? Why do I support ending violence against women? I mean, first of all, because humans should not. I mean, women are humans, which seems to be the cornerstone of that issue, is the sort of view that women are somehow subhuman. And obviously that's unconscionable. But also I think violence against women is a symptom of a much larger problem. And if you can cut that out, it's one step toward equality. It's a massive step toward equality, and perception of, we have to fake it till we make it, I guess, at this point, and say, like, we have to talk about equality all the time, and until we believe it. And the second question was, what can authors do?
Yeah.
I mean, I think, if you're an author who has been thinking about writing a book that touches on this, please do. I think, especially if you've been hesitating, because I feel like the authors who hesitate because they're not sure they'll be able to do it right or to do it justice are the ones who will absolutely make sure that they do it right and do it justice. And then I think the other piece of it is, as authors, like, it is our work to highlight other writers who are doing this work. If we don't have the ability or the capability or the bandwidth or, the willingness to do this ourselves, there are so many women who are writing these books and touching on these issues. I mentioned two, but there are so many more. And our work is to amplify those voices and make sure that they get heard.
Yeah, and if you just stepping out romance a little bit, but not too much. Faith Hunter has this series called Soulwood, and it is literally about a survivor of a cult that has child marriage, that uses rape as punishment, and it explores how the heroine copes with the aftermath after she's left. And like you said, she had help. She had help from a man to leave, and there are lots of little snippets in there about consent. So yeah. I think let's do a round of books. You've mentioned Lisa Kleypas. We mentioned Beverly Jenkins, and you also mentioned
Kennedy Ryan's Long Shot. Maya Rodale has a book called What a Wallflower Wants, where the heroine is a survivor of sexual assault. I'm certain, I know for a fact that I'm missing many, many others. Cressley Cole, actually, who writes paranormal books, and she's written a whole series called Immortals After Dark. Sexual assault is coded into a number of her books.
Nalini Singh also tackles the issue of violence against women and children. And it's like Cressley Cole, she codes it into many of her paranormal romances.
Yeah.
So it's not.
It's interesting in paranormal because I'm particularly interested in this because right now I'm hosting a podcast about the Immortals After Dark series, but I'm particularly interested in this in paranormal because I think that there's a way that paranormal writers are able to tackle these issues in a much more overt, sort of forceful way, because by virtue of the characters being immortal. So the stakes are sort of off the charts, right? Because they can't die. So you're able to kind of view it, the readers are able to view it with a very different mindset. And it almost frees us to negotiate the emotional relationship with violence in a different way.
Yeah, and Faith Hunter is right, supernatural and paranormal, urban fantasy, and I think that's how she got the people thinking about she could write it so beautifully in Soulwood. And I'm going to share something before we wrap up, which is in a urban fantasy Facebook group that I'm part of. So a guy, actually a male reader, said, "Does Soulwood get any better? Nell is just, Nell's the name of the heroine. Nell is just facing all this." And then I wrote to him. I'm going to paraphrase myself because I can't remember exactly. I said, "But isn't it a good thing that Faith is tackling this?" And I told him from a point of view of someone who works in this field, stopping violence against women, Faith does it extremely well. And isn't it good that she's making you feel just that bit uncomfortable with it? Because if you were comfortable with it, I would be questioning what sort of person you are if you're comfortable with reading about child marriage, child rape, and and all these things, and then he thought about it and he wrote a comment back to me and says, "You're right.
Right.
It's important."
I do think
comfortable a little.
Sometimes that conversation is interesting, particularly because I wonder how a reader like that responds to something like the Lisbeth Salander books, the girl with the dragon tattoo books, right? There's a character who has suffered a great deal of past violence and trauma, right? She's a rape survivor, and she sort of channels that energy to revenge, right, and violence. And those books were so immensely popular, but they were also written by a man. So when in the hands of women, I think the perception of the conversation is different. It goes back to preachy being a question, which is ridiculous.
And it's interestingly, we are talking about paranormal romance and UF/PNR, and they also, I'm going to point this out. We have to wrap up soon. I'm going to point this out because it's urban fantasies. It's maybe edging into paranormal romance. Men will read it. So they might not pick up a straight romance, straight on romance book that screams romance on the cover, but they will pick up urban fantasy with romance in it, and they will read it. Yeah.
Right.
So it is interesting to get that sort of feedback from a male reader going, yeah, and then you have to point out to him that, the fact that he's feeling uncomfortable is a good sign.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so we are going to wrap up now, and Sarah's been so kind to set aside time for today's session. Now, Sarah, we have some good news. Someone's picked up a critique session.
Well, great. I'm so excited. I can't wait to read it.
Yeah, so just if you joined us halfway, Sarah's goodies have already gone. We said at the beginning, we've said thank you to Emily, who got the Feminist and Fierce Romance bundle. And now we're going to say thank you to Michelle Donham.
Oh, great. I'm so excited, Michelle. I can't wait to read it.
Yeah, Michelle, we will be in touch with you soon to put you in touch with Sarah. And I'm going to put myself on screen because we're going to share this little slide to tell everyone where to go. Okay, hi, guys. You joined us halfway. This is me, whose voice you've been hearing in the background, talking to Sarah. I'm Regina, and I'm the founder and president of the Pixel Project. Now, Sarah's goodies have all gone. Plenty of goodies left from authors as wide-ranging as Jen Williams, who writes Dragon Fantasy, Tana Nareed Dew, who writes dark fantasy and horror, and Alma Alexander, Caroline Katniss, who, if you watch Netflix, you know about the series You, and that is a really good insight into sociopathic stalker men. Leanna Renee Heber and more. We've got tons of goodies there, and we're trying to reach 5K by April 15th. So if you've got anything to give, there are plenty of goodies from, everything from 5 goodies with a $5 donation request tag to a $500 donation request tag. There are plenty. There's book bundles like the one Sarah had up. There are signed first editions. There are ARCs. There are one-to-one Skype chats and tuckerizations. If you ever wanted to be immortalized in someone's book, we have plenty this time around. So I'm going to screen share the little slide. All right. Sarah, can you see it?
I can.
Okay, so you go to, and Denisha is also going, our chat box moderator is also going to cut and paste the link in the chat box. You go to bit.ly/R4P Rally Up IWD 2019. Now, this is case sensitive. Make sure that you type in the exact address or it won't take you there. And you want to find out more about Read for Pixels, the program and the authors that we've hosted before. You can go to bit.ly/Read for Pixels. And hang on, someone said to make it full screen, but I think this is the fullest screen that will ever make it. Okay, guys, hopefully you can read it because apparently it's not showing a full screen, but it is, Google Hangouts is not letting me adjust the size. If you want to go there and make a donation, please do. It's fundraising is going on until April 15. All your funds go towards helping keep us afloat, keep us alive, keep our work going, keep programs like this going. If you want to see past Hangouts, you can go to our YouTube channel. Right on top is the playlist of Hangouts from the past. Now, I'm going to stop this and put Sarah back on screen because, Sarah, do you have any announcements coming? You've got a new book coming out soon.
I do. I have a book coming out. Brazen and the Beast is out July 30th, and that is the second book in the Bare Knuckle Bastard series. So if you've read Wicked and the Wallflower, this is Whit's book. You have not met his heroine, Hattie, but you will, and she's great, I think. And what else? You can find me on Twitter at Sarah MacLean, and on Instagram at Sarah MacLean. That's where those are the two places that I'm most active. And as I mentioned, I have a podcast called Fated Mates, which is a discussion of romance every week. We are currently doing a large read of Cressley Cole's Immortals After Dark series, but in the intermediate weeks, it's every other week. And in the middle weeks, we tackle a romance trope every week and talk about why it works for readers and do book recommendations on that trope. So you can find us at fatedmates.net for that. And otherwise, you know, I'm always happy to talk about all of this stuff online on Twitter.
Yeah, and it just thought that your podcast is actually a great, this hangout that we're having is actually like a great companion to your podcast.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So, yeah. So so we need to say goodbye now. And if you want to learn more, guys, if you're new to the subject of violence against women and you're feeling a bit, oh no, what can I do about it? It's such a huge issue. Go to our website, www.thepixelproject.net. We've got lots of what people call a first step organization, where we offer you a chance to do something small, maybe you know, attend a hangout or volunteer to write an article for us, one of our campaigns. Or if you're a survivor, here's the thing. If you're a survivor, we're actually taking submissions for our Survivor Stories blog interview campaign, which runs throughout May. So you can go to our website to go to what we do, go to you know, our activities drop-down list and click on Survivor Stories, and you can download the form from there. Fill out. It's a Q&A form, so you don't have to worry about organizing an essay about your experience. Just download the form and answer the questions, and then send it back to us. If you want to find out more about the Celebrity Male Role Model Pixel Reveal campaign, because every dollar that we raise, it reveals one pixel of Nobel Prize Peace Laureate's picture, and he has done decades of work to end violence against women. So you want to find out more about that, go to reveal.thepixelproject.net. Now, Sarah, and I'll put Sarah on screen because we are both going to say thank you and good night to wherever you guys are in the world.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I'm so proud to be a part of this project this year. And thank you all for listening. And I hope you'll give what you can to this great cause.
Yeah, thank you guys.